Hey, my name is Lloyd George, and I think the future of Black media is podcasts.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to Tools for Time Traveling, the podcast equipping creatives to build the future. Today, I'm Gavin Guidry, creative director, sometimes content creator.
And I am Desmond Dickerson, consultant and futurist.
And today we have the honor of being joined by Lloyd George. He's content creator champion, podcast guru, brand sponsorship guru, whatever you want to call him, and host of the Creator Hub podcast for aspiring creators who want to take their content business to the next level. We're super excited to be talking to Lloyd today. How's it going, Lloyd?
Hey, thanks for having me. Huge fan of the show. Day's going well. I've been looking forward to this all day. This is like the highlight of my day.
Amazing. We are so
Fantastic.
so glad to hear that. Cool. Well, let's jump into it. I'm sure everybody's really excited to get into this. We heard you at the top of the episode say that you believe the future of Black media is podcasts. And so we definitely want to unpack that. But actually, before we jump in, but before we get into that, why don't you just tell the audience a little bit about what makes you qualified to make that statement? So, like, who are you and what do you do? We know who you are, we know what you do, but please tell the people.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Lloyd. You may have known me or seen me on different platforms as like the podcast guy. I love creating content about podcasting. My mission and my goal is to get as many creators of color as possible to create podcasts. I believe that there are large opportunities. I've personally seen the benefits of how a podcast can change your life, both personally and professionally. And I think for Black creators and creators of color, there's such a huge opportunity for us here.
Man, you've ain't said nothing but a word, man. That is very true. And I actually I had the honor of meeting Lloyd through Spotify actually. So I work on the Spotify for Podcasters brand, helping with creative direction, and we work with Lloyd often. I would say actually to talk about different creator and podcasting topics, to give tools and techniques and advice. And so just like a wealth of knowledge. So when we linked up, we have an Atlanta connection here as well. So just like really excited to be chatting and giving people these gems.
ATL.
Yeah, as I was looking up I always do like pretty good research when we bring guests on because I just want to be respectful of folks' expertise and their time and whatnot.
He's our Nardwar. He's our Nardwar.
Yeah, and I'm like, wait a minute, this guy went to Georgia State. Like, hold on a second, how did we not cross paths at that time? I was student there and then worked at Georgia Perimeter, which is like a satellite of Georgia State University. So yeah, it's crazy none of us made those connections at the time, but you're here now.
It's funny now. I see not just like Georgia Perimeter and Georgia State, but even like larger schools adding like creator programs, not just like music programs, but literally like there's lots of schools that have like podcast programs. So it's interesting just to see like colleges like adapt this idea of like creatorship.
Yeah. So as we, start to delve into the topic here and a weighty statement that you've shared that the future of Black media is podcasts. I know we're going to get a lot of eye rolls, a lot of groans. If people are just tired of podcasts already.
Yep.
So could you break down what do you mean by that? What do you mean that the future of Black media is going to be podcasts?
Yeah, so I think that statement is true for a number of different reasons, right? The first being just sort of like the autonomy that podcasting gives you to truly share your opinion. Currently, with where podcasting is, I think it's under-regulated. And I'm not saying that that's like a great thing. I think in the future, we will have more regulation about what people can say, what they can say, the extent of like misinformation and the risks that come with that. But as it stands right now, if you had an opinion that isn't welcomed on TV or on different blogs or Twitter, you theoretically could start a podcast and Elon Musk couldn't kick you off, theoretically speaking. And so just from like, that's just one perspective, right? Where it's like, as the Black community, I think it helps us and benefits us, I think, to have a platform and a space where we can share our opinions. I also think in the same vein, on the flip side of that, it's also the platform that has the lowest barrier to entry. And so anyone that does want to become a creator, someone, even someone like me, when I wanted to become a creator in 2018, I was terrified to create content. I couldn't even share my opinion concisely. And so it wasn't until I started podcasting, because I didn't need to share my face, that I was able to start practicing and get comfortable sharing my opinions
Mm.
with the world. So I just think there's so many different verticals and so many different ways where the statement and the idea that Black media could benefit from embracing podcasting is true.
Okay. Okay. So I was gonna ask like what's so special about podcasts, but you're already kind of hitting on it there. So it sounds like your viewpoint there is that if you are an aspiring media personality, right? You want to get into news, whether it's like celebrity news or business news or whatever that is, the podcast can be your proving ground, right? Where you're cutting your teeth, you're building your skill set and just your ability to communicate.
1000%. When you think about the number of hours in which people consume podcasting, it's greater than any other medium. The likelihood
Mm,
that someone is going to watch your TikTok video for maybe like up to 60 seconds, that's cool. Someone is going to watch your YouTube video for maybe 10 minutes. That's cool. The idea
mm,
that someone's going to listen to you talk about a specific thing for like an hour, sometimes even 3 hours, that's just like crazy. And so when you think about it from
Yeah.
that perspective, it's more likely that the content you're putting on your podcast can act as a portfolio. And so for someone like me that didn't
Mm.
graduate from college,
Mm.
I'm able to create content on a weekly basis. And because people can validate my expertise from this podcast, I'm more likely, I use it personally as like a portfolio, quite frankly. And so I
Yeah.
think even just from that perspective, the number of doors that can open for you as a Black person is just like huge.
Yeah. And I think there's something too, even if you're not necessarily trying to get into media per se, right? Like you're not necessarily trying to be like a news anchor or, something like that. It's sort of what you were saying with like the low barrier to entry with podcasts and the sort of like autonomy to share your opinion. It kind of just like becomes like there's this in the startup world, this concept of an MVP, like a minimum viable product, that you need to sort of like get across if you're going to pitch something, right? And so let's say you want to be like the sports agent of the future, or you want to be a comedian, or you want to be an activist or something like that. Something that's like that low of a barrier of entry, it allows you to really like get your ideas across and prove like what is like, I need to get a proof of concept out here, right? And so it kind of allows you to do that. That's a lot of like what brings us here today, actually. When it comes to like we have something we think creators can help sort of like get us to the future. And so in order to like get that thought and idea across to people, we started a podcast, and it is a very low barrier way to do it. So I think you're certainly onto something there.
That's a great point, because like in that vein, I think when startups do create minimal viable products, I think what they're trying to do is find people that resonate with that sort of like problem clause. So this idea that like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
whatever problem you're trying to solve and what you think is the solution, I agree with that and I want to come on board with that. And so when you think about it from that perspective, I think podcasting is a great place to find your super fans, the people that really
Yeah,
resonate with those ideas. Nobody's going to listen to your content for like an hour unless they do. So it's
totally.
I think like I'm overwhelmed just even by this question and trying to overstate the values of podcasting. But I am curious, just since you guys have started one, what has that experience kind of been like for you?
Oh man, look at this guy flipping the roles here
Yeah.
on us.
He's a pro. He's a pro.
Yeah, no, he's good.
You got it.
All right, yeah, sure. I'll jump in. It's similar to what you said. It validates things, particularly in the first season in which we did this. Pretty much every interview, every episode that we did, we used a different strategic foresight tool. So for me, it was just excellent getting additional reps at this, because these are tools that I
Yeah.
use at work. These are tools that I use to help businesses or organizations, divisions within a business to think about like, how are you going to innovate? How are you going to bring the future that you're seeking to fruition? So it was just great validation for that. Of course, great to build the network. Like, in what other scenario would I have been able to have an hour-long conversation with the president of the Recording Academy, right? Like, it doesn't happen without this. So those are the ways that it's certainly been like a huge benefit on my end. Gavin, what about you?
Yeah, I would say, the benefits of it really being a proving ground are like incalculable. Like the amount of ideas that we're able to get out and express are quite astounding. And then I think also I do a lot of talking about how, creators, similar to you, Lloyd, how creators can sort of get their thoughts out there, get their stories out there, and have autonomy in the way that they do that. And a lot of ways people do that is by gaining an audience, right? And a podcast is a great way to do that, because it's hard for me to get out my true thoughts on, the future of the creator economy, or what I think about lots of different current events, or different things like that, just through the medium of like photography, like on Instagram or like IG stories or something like that. So yeah, it just provides a place where we're starting to create conversations among people, and getting that engagement. It can be from one person, but you get that engagement and like, yo, I really liked when you said this. It's just like, oh man, like I can talk about this for days and days and days.
Yeah.
So
It's addicting.
totally. It's definitely addicting.
Sorry, just to add to it quick, to what Des said, I love what you said too, because I think this idea where it's like, it's not only, I think, just the access that you get to certain people that normally wouldn't spend an hour with you, but when you think about the quality of those conversations, I used to say like, yo, if you interview someone, I can't describe it, but the relationship is just different. And I think part of why is because it's like, even if you and I were to get to coffee, we may be like checking our phones, we may be preoccupied with other thoughts. The likelihood that you and I are going to talk for like an hour with no distractions is kind of a foreign concept these days.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. It gives you almost a throwback, to yesteryear, where you've got full engagement. Like I'm feeling like I'm Walter Cronkite over here, man. Like you just like they're locked in, like every word, like they're just yes, and this is what I have to say about that. It feels good.
Yeah.
And I think also for the guests, it's like validating to them, to get their ideas out.
I love that.
Totally. Awesome. So wanna keep progressing towards this future state of Black media being podcasts. What current trend is moving us in that direction, right? So, I'm sure there's a lot of things that you're seeing out there that's sort of like putting this in your mind. But yeah, what are those current trends that you're seeing that are helping progress us towards this future?
Yeah, I think the biggest is just sort of like the opportunity that exists for Black content creators, right? For example, just one example, if you look at the rate at which Black listeners are consuming audio content, I think as it stands right now, there was a article that came out by Edison Research. They put it out every year. It's called the Black Listener Report. And I actually got to chat with Gabe, the guy who led the effort in creating that report. As it stands right now, Black listeners listen to about 6 hours of audio content. About 10 to 15% of that is podcast content. That number continues to increase, meaning that like Black listeners are listening to more and more audio. If that report also added a note that highlighted that about 70% of the Black listeners that consumed podcast content wanted more Black podcasters, meaning that we need more Black hosts creating content. And so at the bare minimum, the opportunity to create content for an audience that wants it is growing. And so I just think it's an open field for anyone that wants to create content that is Black. And so I think that is just like probably the most exciting thing about this idea of like Black media starting to embrace podcasts. Currently, as it stands, I think Black media looks at podcasting kind of as like the distant cousin.
And so almost to like marry that or bring those two ideas together, right? Can you paint a picture for us, right? So you're saying, okay, the future of Black media is podcast. What does that future look like? How would that manifest? I think someone could hear that phrase and just be like, all right, what are you even saying here? But like, what would a future in which podcasts are central to Black media, or the foundation of Black media, what would that even look like?
Okay, so I think it looks like usage of podcasting in more everyday efforts, more everyday ways. So for example, say you're enrolled at Clark Atlanta, right? Maybe your teacher doesn't have an email list. Maybe she has a weekly podcast, and that's how you get the updates on what's happening in the class. This is not like a new concept. Like lots of schools are starting to embrace this and sort of like other demographics. I think I haven't seen that many Black thought leaders embrace podcasting in that concept. For example, like your pastor, right? Your teachers, right? Your apartment complexes, your community leaders. our health organizations. I think in general, there's more of an opportunity to use podcasting as a way that we can give weekly updates about information we need to know about. That's like sort of like one layer. A second layer could be, I think there's a big opportunity for micro businesses. There's a podcast in an area called Stonecrest, Georgia, which is like an up and coming neighborhood. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
Black lady there that started a podcast that is doing very, very well. It's like a community resource. You can listen to it to learn about all of like the new businesses in the area, all of the new changes from like city council, right? And like lots of people listen to that podcast that would never tune into like city council meetings, right? So it's just a
Mm.
more accessible way to share
Yeah, yeah,
information,
yeah.
right? So that could be technically applied across like all of America, technically, right? So I just think there's a lot of opportunities like that to bring information in a more tangible way to consumers.
I'm
Love that.
so glad you mentioned that, man. I was reading just like earlier this week about the use of AI, generative AI technology, and other like forms of AI to essentially flesh out local news. Right, local news has really suffered and kind of died off in the past 15 years due to lack of resources and just different places people are investing their money and their time. But exactly what you're saying, right? If we have a woman who has a podcast focusing on local issues, she, records all of the city council meetings, all of the school board meetings, and then uses an AI tool that helps to pull out the key quotes, the key decisions that were made. And then she can just take that and, record that and present that to her local audience in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah.
In some ways, she's almost like her own one person, one woman local news bureau.
Yep, literally. And that's what I think is like very interesting about where we are in the world of podcasting. Traditionally, people have embraced podcasting because it's so human that like it's like you're listening to somebody like in your ears that's like a human that like is like it's like their personality and it almost feels
Mm-hmm.
like people. And I think that's why the trust factor is so high in podcasting. With generative
Yeah.
AI becoming more and more of a thing, I think podcasters are thinking about ways they can like make their workflow a little more efficient without sort of losing that personal connection to their audience. And so I think it's forcing a lot of podcasters to be very creative about what their new setup looks like.
Definitely. I think the way that you're talking about podcasts being used in everyday scenarios is really interesting. I think in the face of like some trends that, I feel like we're seeing, both like Black and Hispanic news and media organizations either losing funding, sort of like dying out. Even if the demand is there, the spending in those industries for Black and Hispanic media and news companies is just not there. So
Mm-hmm.
it does seem like almost like a natural way for these creators and these people in these communities who have things to say to be able to supplement a little bit of that. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're saying that it's a lot more affordable to start a podcast that shares information than it is to spin up like an entire like news department or a TV like news department, right?
Totally.
Yeah,
Yeah,
one
totally.
1000% agree. And I've been seeing a lot more companies is sort of like, especially with like the for those that may not know, podcasting is sort of going through a change because video is being introduced. And so it's been interesting to see some institutions decline to add video, even though it can expand their reach, primarily because they
Mm.
want to keep their costs lower. And so it's going to be interesting just to see how people react to all of these changes in the future to keep podcasting as lean as it's been, which is why a lot of people have started it.
Yep. So I think when we talk about Black media, I think people start to immediately think of news networks or TV networks or whatever that may be. And so just checking out your podcast and your social media and some of the things that you're talking about, I see that you're talking a lot about podcast networks. So could you talk a little bit about what podcast networks are? And is that sort of a signal that sort of makes you feel that the future of Black media could be podcasts?
Yeah, absolutely. I even more so, I recently interviewed Crystal Hill, who
Yeah.
is the director of podcasting at a brand called the Black Love. And part of what we spoke about is like, what is podcasting? And she spoke about the fact that like a podcast network is a network of different podcasts that have a common thread. Like maybe they all talk about the same topic or they're from the same area. And so I think being in a network naturally increases your ability to get new listeners and expand your reach, which I think in turn makes it a little easier to monetize your podcast. And so I think in the future, if all three of us are podcasters here, I think because we're both Black, if we were to share resources and start an informal network between the two of us, I think it would, a lot of the challenge in starting a podcast is figuring out how to grow it. And so I think starting a network, joining a network, partnering with other podcasters that are Black could lower some of the challenges that we would face in trying to grow our podcast, which is why I think that could help this idea that like podcasting and Black media are going to continue to grow together.
I think we do see that be really successful even now, right? Like, I think this is sort of like a signal for the future, but I think even now with like, Des and I talk about the Ringerverse quite often, like we really like the Ringerverse, and like, how they can have essentially one quote unquote channel, like one podcast channel, but within that there's so many different shows. Like there's several different shows, but that common thread, as you talked about, is just that fandom and that almost like nerddom, right? And so even though like, okay, well, I listened to the Midnight Boys with Van Lathan, I could stick around and like watch House of R because they're also talking about this show that I like. But I didn't know them before, so now I'm introduced to this creator, and Scott Galloway has like all of these different shows under Prof G, and just different ways that creators, and like I don't even know if I should bring up his name, but Joe Budden, for say what you will, but I mean, he has definitely created somewhat of a podcasting empire, but all under sort of like the this Joe Budden. I think he calls it the Joe Budden Network. So I think we're starting to see how that can really pay off and maybe be the beginning of something.
Yeah, 1000%. And I think too, I hear a lot of like Black podcasters talk about this idea of like independence, and I think a lot of podcasters look at what's happening in the music industry in terms of partnering with larger brands and feeling like people are screwing them over. And so I think this idea of sort of like independent podcast networks kind of challenges that idea that like, hey, you don't have to assign to like a large network. You could get four of your homies, y'all promote each other, and a lot of the things that you would gain from being in a network, you would gain from your friends. So I'm hoping that this like encourages more people just to step out there and collaborate more.
It's like it kind of feels like our future, like in those days where it was like, there's obviously like representation there, but really it was like a group of friends who were just like all around each other making stuff, and they all just happen to be like still some of the biggest artists and the biggest influencers in hip hop and our broader culture that we have today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Listen, related to that, I feel very strongly about the premise of like collective genius, right? Especially collective creative genius. Whether it is Odd Future and you've got like kind of this like indie like R&B band, and then like several rappers and like R&B singer producers, and they all come together, or going back before that, and you've got like Dungeon Family in Atlanta, which is Outkast and Goody Mob, Sleepy Brown. They had an in-house production crew, all sorts of other artists that were a part of that. Eventually Killer Mike, eventually Future, and it's just like this crew of people creating together. Wu-Tang Clan. Like there's just so many examples of what happens when you have this loose collective of people working together for the greater good collectively, but then also doing their own individual things. How they push one another, how they promote one another. Just naturally it happens.
Yeah, 1000%. I think that like a lot of people assume that like it's like a lot of people in a network, especially if you look at like networks that are coming up, like Black Love is a great example, where it's like all of the shows on there are pretty good independently. Like they're all like solid. Like you would assume that it's like, these shows are all kind of coming together to make one strong unit, but they can all kind of like stand alone pretty well. And so I think to your point that it's sort of like creating a group of like Avengers, and I think each of the shows and people kind of make each other stronger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
So as we jump back into, kind of following this through line of your prediction about, the future of Black media being podcasts, what do you think will be the ripple effects of this prediction coming to fruition?
That's a great question, and one that I'm still trying to figure out because I think my answer to this changes every day. I used to think that, like, man, if we all just get to a point where I feel like all of the Black podcasters are getting the resources they needed, networks are investing in us, we are getting equal opportunities, and like, great. Like I can say that, like, like we're at a point where I feel like Black media can be sustainable. But sometimes I also think that, like, maybe that isn't the answer. Maybe that isn't like the ideal state. Like maybe the ideal state is that there are just 100,000 more Black podcasters that are able to like share their opinion, that have decided, you know what, I'm going to pick up a mic and start creating. If you think about someone like me that essentially leveraged podcasting to get a job, I don't need a network. I don't need brand deals. I don't need any of those things, right? Like podcasting served its purpose in getting me more opportunities. So I go back and forth on thinking about what like success looks like as a whole for like Black podcasters.
But I do like sort of like the dichotomy that you've presented here. It's like either we like all squat up as Black podcasters, or it's just, yeah, like you said, it's the benefit of just having more Black voices, more independent Black voices out there. I think that those are two potential sort of like ripple effects that we can start to see with that.
Sorry, just to add a
ahead.
point to that, I was
Yeah.
at a conference last year in Atlanta called the Black Podfest, and I ran into
Yeah.
a guy, a Black gentleman that has a podcast where he shares tips on just like diabetes resources, so information for people that have diabetes or
Yeah.
preventative tips, that sort of stuff. And it just blew my mind that this guy was putting out like few hours of content per month completely for free, right? Like what like a great resource that is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like imagine that with like everything. Like someone that
Wow.
wants to become an optometrist, someone that wants to go to college, like tips on like
Mm-hmm.
your algebra stuff. And I guess in some ways, like you could say like YouTube and podcasting overlap from that perspective. But when you think about the sheer amount of content, if you look at like a podcast like the Dave Ramsey podcast, which is not a Black podcast, but they have like almost like, I mean, thousands, almost like 5,000 hours of like content
Yeah.
that's just like free.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about podcasting from that perspective, it really has the opportunity to be a resource.
So that sounds like another ripple effect. You were saying, you're kind of iffy on them, but that's a huge ripple effect. Imagine it being like the ripple effect is this, more engaging yet accessible educational resource for personal health, or for, like you said, if you're an optometrist and or aspiring optometrist and you're learning more about that before you sink, 4 years or whatever into grad school.
Yep.
I mean,
1,000%.
I think that could even speak to like almost like a self-sustaining like Black community ecosystem, right? Like people talk a lot about the Black economy and our dollar and like, are we going to other Black people for this or that? But like, if we do really have people who look like us in our community putting out those resources, and we know that there's always going to be those resources for us, it almost hopefully becomes almost like a sort of like a cyclical sort of like sustaining resource, community resource, which is really cool too. So
Yeah.
that could have like that could have like really immediate community effects, I think.
Yep, 1,000%. And I think the last thing I'll add to that is I think there's like a huge opportunity for, I don't know any like large Black businesses that are doing this just yet, but Trader Joe's, for example, has a podcast and the employees get to like listen to it. It's basically like their weekly team meetings. And so instead of it being a meeting where everyone is on the call, they just get a podcast, and while they're working or shelving stuff, they're learning about like, hey, these are the newest spices. Here's why we added this spice, information about it. And it's super,
That's
it's a
amazing.
dope concept. Yeah. And so I think there's an opportunity just to think about in what ways could podcasting be helping us from like a business standpoint.
Yeah. That's amazing. Sorry, I love this conversation we're having. I'm feeling very inspired.
It's funny how much we're talking about the future, right? And how all the future implications this has on media. But in many ways, it feels like it is a thread from the past as well. You know, the concept of a griot, right? A member of a traveling class of like poets, storytellers, just these folks that maintain oral traditions or oral history. You know, this is a term that originates in West Africa. So it's just interesting to see that's always been there. And now this is almost that for a you know, the present and for the future. Like, this is the way that griots now exist and how they disseminate their information in new ways.
Yo, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's something I don't even think we talk about enough. There's a gentleman named Corey Cambridge, actually based out of LA, but he did this partnership. I'm not going to say the name of the company because I don't want to like butcher it, but basically he ran a podcast where he was essentially trying to like deep dive into like his family history. And so he sort of like starts to like go back, and it's crazy to like see it happen in real time, because like each week he's meeting someone and that leads to another person that he should know, and it just goes and goes and goes, and he actually ends up discovering another guy that he's related to because they had the same, it was like grandfather or great grandfather or something. But to see him go through this journey, sort of like tracking down his like family lineage, is wild, insane. And so to your point, I've even seen like another lady that has a podcast where she just interviews all of like her older family members, and they're essentially, it's like a way to like bond together, right? And when you think about it, her grandkids will now have all of these stories, right? So it's exactly, like it's such a great way to just keep stories in the family lineage.
Wow. Yeah. Again, as we started these conversations always take a twist that I'm not expecting, right? As we started this and you put that topic out there, I was thinking, okay, Black media. I'm thinking in terms of maybe Radio One or BET or Revolt or a whole new network that doesn't exist yet. But it's really fascinating to hear your definition, or the definition that we're landing on for Black media, or, you know, multicultural media, whatever, isn't just in a business standpoint, isn't just in a corporation standpoint on television or radio, but it could also be, you know, community news, kind of taking the place of like newspapers, or, you know, worked into like an education system, and how like the audio and oral traditions are kept alive through that. So this is just, man, it's such an expansive future that you've opened us to.
Yeah, and I think to your point, like podcasting has been around since 2003, but it's still such an early medium that we're molding it and getting to choose like what it becomes. And so I think that's like one just more reason that I think we as like Black creators should be inclined to be leveraging podcasting, because I think like if you look at the music industry, I felt like we didn't have an opportunity to participate in the ownership of the music industry. And when you look at podcasting, I think that opportunity still exists. So we are creating what the podcast industry will look like 10 years from now. And so we do get to play a role in molding like how we use it, what we use it for, some of like the principles that we want to become common, or even sort of like ownership from like I think we play a big role in like what is popularized and the content that we love. You just mentioned the Joe Budden podcast. I hope in 10 years when we get there, we also own just as much of a stake, considering that we'll have influenced the industry drastically.
100%. Love that. Cool. I'm gonna keep the conversation moving. So when we talk about reaching a future state, and this is what Des has taught me, we also have to figure out like how exactly are we getting there. So wanted to ask you, and you know, I know that you are a pro in every sense of the word, even when that comes to the technology and the equipment and things like that. So curious from your standpoint, if you are thinking of any technological advancements that will need to occur in order for this prediction to come to fruition.
Yes, lots. I think in a lot of ways, podcasting is a great medium as it is right now. But in other ways, there's like a lot of opportunity for improvement. For instance, if you look at all of the other like media forums like YouTube or music or streaming, all of them have like tremendous analytics. Podcasting still doesn't have great analytics. Now that's a good thing because our privacy has not been invaded, right, from a tracking standpoint to gather those analytics. But it's a bad thing for people that create content and advertisers and their speediness to get into the space. And so I hope in the future that like from a technology standpoint, if we're going to get where we want podcasting to go, we have to get better analytics, just as like for one. And then for two, I think we need to continue to keep the barrier low. And so this is where I like applaud like some of the work that Spotify has done in making it so easy to start a podcast. I hope it remains that way. You kind of start to hear language like we have too many podcasts or there's not enough room for a new podcast. But if you look at the data that's come out earlier this year, all data indicates that more people are listening to podcasts, but less people are creating podcasts, which just creates more opportunity for creators like ourselves.
Fascinating. Are there any other technological advancements that you think need to happen? Or shifting gears, are there any cultural developments, cultural shifts that you think might need to happen along this pathway?
I'm it's tough to say because I think this is where my opinion differs. I think from everyone else in the industry. I'm known for wanting to keep like the barrier to entry as low as possible, and so the idea that anyone would need anything else, or even to like continue the growth that we're seeing in podcasting, that something else would have to occur, to me feels like we're like gatekeeping and adding roadblocks for people to start. So, for example, there's a lot of people that feel like the beauty of podcasting is audio first. And so if you don't have a microphone, it's not in your best interest that you start. I hate that idea. Like I'm all for like, yo, pick up your phone, terrible audio, who cares? Like, let's roll. And I believe like that's the attitude we need if we're gonna have more people continue to start podcasting. And so I think to me, I believe at the rate that we are right now, if nothing else was added, I still think we would see growth in the podcast space. I think one thing we don't talk enough about, in addition to like all of like, I think when we think about the future and what I hope to see in the future, I think we don't talk enough about like the risks and challenges as well. And I only thought of that because I think when Gavin said what he was saying, I'm just like you, Gavin, in the sense that like I'm such like a video geek, and so it's like I needed to like look good, I needed to do all the things. I kind of put my own barriers there. But when I think about just podcasting in its simplest form, it's just so simple. And so with that, I think like some of the risks that we haven't necessarily spoken about are just sort of like it is very easy for people to use this platform to create not only for like misinformation, but also to create content that just isn't like helpful or uplifting. And when you think about the number of kids that are like under 18, under 21, that can so easily be influenced that do consume this content, I think that's like a big risk that I'm not sure what the solution for that is just yet. But I mean, what are you guys' thoughts on that?
I'm so glad you asked that, because that was one of our next questions for you. Both sides of the spectrum, right? As we think about the direct or indirect results of your prediction, right, where there's a proliferation of podcasts and it kind of filters out throughout the rest of the Black media ecosystem, what is going to be the most negative impact there? To you, it sounds like the spread of misinformation or disinformation, or folks that lack the credentials and them starting to share those messages. I would agree with that for sure. Couple that with just the outrage farming, right? The media landscape at this point has been optimized for binaries, right? You're on this side or you're on that side. You think this way or you think that way, or you put out an incendiary comment knowing people are going to misconstrue, or they're going to be like very just disgusted and frustrated about it. So I think that becomes a bigger and bigger concern around media and the direction it's headed in. Like it's much more incentivized to say things that are going to get folks riled up than to get them inspired or excited or joyful.
Yeah, I agree with that. And some people, I think some people assume that because podcasting is perfect for building micro communities, that it would be the perfect place for people of any opinion to have their own platform, because they're only going to attract these small communities of people that believe what they believe. But I 1000% agree. I think that's probably the thing that's most concerning.
I think that might sort of like going back to the technological advancement, maybe there is the need for better AI policing. And so like that could be another use of AI. I know that we often, when we talk about AI, especially in social media spaces and things like that, we get into, there's always like a bit of like bias in that, because we know like how the machine learns. But I think maybe that is a nut that we need to crack in order to get to this place where like podcasts can bear the weight of being Black media, essentially.
I agree. There's definitely a lot of opportunity. I think I'm very afraid of AI in the podcast space from the content perspective, but I think
Yeah.
it's the only way, I think, to like scale podcasting in the way that we're discussing.
So yeah, we talked a little bit about like some of the negative impacts potentially of podcasting reaching this level. What are some of the greatest positive impacts we can see from that, though?
Yeah, absolutely. And just one last negative before I go to the
Yeah.
positives.
Yeah.
I think podcasting has it's very difficult. It can be very difficult to monetize. That hasn't
Hmm.
been my experience. It's actually been, I think, easier to monetize. But I do think in general, for most people, it's harder to monetize because podcast listeners are more committed, meaning that once you have a loyal listener, they are worth a lot, but it is very hard to get that loyal listener. And so,
Hmm.
because of that, it's very difficult to convince a lot of creators to invest time in podcasting when it's like, hey, you're probably going to need to give this 3 years before you monetize it. That's just not a luxury that a lot of people have. And so,
Yeah.
that is just sort of like another negative. In terms of positives, though, I will say, I find that podcasting has been great because it, in my opinion, I think creates multiple revenue streams for people. So if you look at podcasters that start to gain success from podcasting, it is a little easier for them to break off and do like live events or to do merch, right? And so I think that just speaks to that idea of having like a committed and loyal audience and how valuable that is in like other verticals.
Yeah.
There was a guy that I can't remember the name of the show, but there's a gentleman that spoke about a guy that runs a large podcast was telling a story about his friend and how his friend's podcast didn't have that many downloads, but when you factored in their total revenue for the year, it was about $7 million per year. And so they were able to have this small podcast with a small listenership, but they were also able to do consulting services. They were also able to
Yeah.
do merch, live shows, so
Mm.
on and so forth. So just from a revenue perspective, I think that's a pretty big pro.
Yeah, we talked about it a bit when we chatted with Bosco, who's the owner of Slug Global, and so they are not only an agency, not only a record label, but they do similar to what you were saying. Like they put out a lot of that content, but they also do a lot of consulting, a lot of content creation, a lot of brand deals, and we were talking about the three horizons for music creators, and we were talking about the third horizon, way off in the future, let's say a decade, let's say 15 years, being moving on from the creator economy and moving more towards creator ecosystems, and giving creators the ability to create ecosystems around themselves. And it kind of sounds like a little bit of what you were describing, where yes, I sort of use podcasting as my medium, but that opens the door to create merch and to write a book and to do consulting and to design clothes and do all of these community events and things like that. So it does feel like that could definitely be sort of like one of those direct results.
Yeah, for sure. There's a show on Netflix. It's a finance show by a guy named Rohit. And that show actually was birthed out of like his podcast. And so I think that's
Yeah.
just like I've been seeing a lot more podcasters use that as a way to get into TV, which is cool too.
Yeah. Which brings us back to Black media, huh? Yeah. Awesome. So speaking of those three horizons, we want to, with your prediction of the future of Black media being podcasts, we want to say if these things happen, right? We've talked about like today, right? We have the lower barrier to entry. More people are creating, more people are consuming podcasts. People are finding super fans there. Some of them are able to monetize. they're able to sort of come together and create these podcast networks. We're sort of like at the beginning of that. So what does this look like in the next 3 years? We kind of want to plot it out like 3 years, 7 years, and then maybe like a decade or further. But let's start at 3 years. Like what does your prediction of like Black media is podcast? What does that look like in 3 years?
All right. I look at it in sort of like three verticals, kind of. The
Okay.
first is that like there are more just sort of like everyday creators you starting to use podcasting as their preferred medium. And so in the same way that people say, I'm going to create a TikTok or YouTube, instead, they're saying, I'm going to create a podcast. So that's like the first layer for me. The second layer is if you look at sort of like large brands, there aren't that many Black run networks where
Mm-hmm.
a large brand could say, I'm willing to spend $50 million in podcast advertising. I want it all spent with like a Black network. There is no large Black network big enough to even manage all of that. With the exception, I'd say Charlemagne's network is probably like the closest thing that I can think of. And maybe there's a few out there that I just don't know about. And so to me, 3 years from now, there are more Black owned networks that specialize in Black content that have a large number of downloads or impressions for advertisers to buy. So I think that's like the second layer to me. And then the third layer, I think, is it's being utilized in more Black institutions. So podcasting is being used in our local city councils, at our jobs, in our universities. This is a trend that's already happening. It's just not mainstream just yet. And so I hope 3 years from now, there's more of that.
Wow,
Amazing.
that's a lot to accomplish in 3 years. So
I know.
as we think about that being Horizon One, and I'm not saying it's bad or good like that. I love that you're that specific and that detailed about what Horizon One could look like. So that's 3 years, right? So building on that, 7 years out, what does this prediction look like?
Yeah, great question. So it's all of that plus one more thing. In my opinion, it's ownership. So 7 years from now, as podcasting grows as predicted, when we get to 7 years from now, the people that own like our microphone companies, there's at least one that's Black owned. I personally, at this present moment, don't know of a microphone company that's Black owned, which is like, that is just like the craziest thing I've ever heard. Same with like all of like our SaaS companies, right? From like analytics, right? So we know that right now, as it stands, there may only be two virtual recording platforms, right? A recording platform is similar to what we're using. It's like Zoom, but specifically for podcasting. I'm hoping 7 years from now that there's two or three Black owned hosting companies. And so it's 7 years. I'm hoping all of the first three things I mentioned for 3 years, except more ownership.
Okay, cool. And then to bring it on home, right? So that's where you're looking at it for Horizon 2, 7 years out. A decade from now, what does this look like? How has your prediction played out at this time in 2033?
All right, this is it is a bit aggressive. I'm gonna disclaim it. It is a bit crazy.
Let's
All
go.
right.
Let's do it.
So I think like in my mind, the ideal scenario, and I understand that this is very, very hard. The ideal scenario is about like a decade from now, as Black creators, and now after 7 years, Black owners, we're in a position where we can systemize sort of like what the industry will look like. I did a program a few years ago for a pretty well-known college institution, and part of what we were trying to figure out is what can we be doing now to start influencing pre-K kids to eventually become doctors by the time that they're like 18 or deciding what they want to do when they go to college, right? And so it's things like investing in specific after school programs in specific communities, right? So on and so forth. I want the exact same thing, but for podcasting, right? And so when you think about sort of like how comfortable a lot of like our teenagers are with Twitch or streaming, right? They've been doing this for like the last 6 years, right? It's not a new concept to them, right? There are some kids I've seen that have the same sort of reaction to podcasting, but for the most part, it's kind of taboo, right? And so I think that like introducing podcasting or even just like being a creator in general to more Black creators at a younger age could be beneficial in how they tell stories by the time they get to 18, 19, 21, you know?
Got it. As you hit on that note, right? I know the stereotypes that come with podcasting oftentimes, particularly like within black podcasts. There's going to be a ton of people that are like, oh, you got all these relationship podcasts or people sharing their hot takes about, relationships or society that maybe are a little regressive or outdated or just kind of like what, like just oddball stuff, right? And someone might hear what you're saying, like, whoa, why would you want to funnel kids from being doctors into being, podcasters? So I'd also love to hear you talk a little bit about when you talk about podcasting, like what type of content is coming to mind for you, and how does that distinguish maybe what some of the more negative stuff that folks are turned off by?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for me, right, and I'll start by just sort of like a personal example about how I've utilized podcasting as a tool and how I think it applies to like the broader example you mentioned. So on paper, right, because I didn't go to college, I maybe don't look like the most I have like a more non-traditional path professionally, right? And so by day, like my trade is like I'm a freelance project manager, right? And so if you're looking at my resume and you're judging my expertise on whether you will or won't hire me just on the resume, it may look like I'm not qualified, right? But if you listen to 4 weeks or maybe 8 weeks or 3 months of like my podcast content, specifically talking about project management, the different projects I've managed, the different approaches we've had to take, the specific thing I've learned that week, you get such a broader picture of my expertise. I've actually gotten tons of like job offers just from like people listening to my podcast, seeing it on LinkedIn and clearly saying like, oh, this guy knows like what he's talking about, right? And so I think that like podcasting can act as a tool for all the things that we want to do. And so in this example, I don't think that like kids would necessarily veer away from being like doctors, but I think they could document their college experience on a podcast and all their internships and all the things they're learning, and that could help them in the future. I think a great example of this is a YouTuber named Ali Abdaal, who was a doctor but now a full-time creator, who leveraged his platform to like document his experience during college. And so I think podcasting can be a great tool to accomplish all these other things.
I love that.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like we're kind of, throughout this conversation have been talking about like a future state where podcasting could really be like a utility, in a way that it's not only a creative expression, but also just like a utility for us to be able to communicate, advocate, just sort of, live life and like do essential things,
Yep. Absolutely. There's a finance manager that each week kind of counsels like a new couple on their finances. So it's anonymous, but he'll say, this couple lives in this area, they have 30,000 in debt, this is their income, and this is their situation, and this is how I'd recommend they overcome it. And he does that every week. So by the time you've listened to him for a year, you've heard him like express his expertise 52 times. The likelihood that I'm going to go in and say like, hey, do you have any testimonials is just like unlikely, right? Like it's just like, it's so I think from that perspective, to your point about it being like a utility and a tool in our tool belt, I think we have a big opportunity to use it for that.
Amazing. So as we come to the end of our time here, we've talked about some of the potentially negative impacts, whether that be more misinformation, disinformation, or micro communities around maybe things that we don't want micro communities around, but also some of the great positives as well, in terms of like representation or different revenue streams for Black creators. So let's say we're standing in 2023, everything that you just mentioned has come to fruition. Is this the future that we want, is my question to you.
I think I don't know how to answer that just yet, because I think to me, the answer is yes, because I think that our current media outlets don't provide all of the things that I'd love to see, for example, equal opportunities, or even just ability to share information freely, so on and so forth. And so this idea of podcasting playing that, like filling that role down the future, to me sounds like the perfect solution to a lot of like the challenges that we see now. I think that there are some like variables that can take place that will determine whether like things have worked out as we planned. For example, if podcasting and the consumption of podcasting, the creation of podcasting continue to increase, meaning we have more creators starting podcasts, if everything continues as planned for the next decade, as I anticipate, but we don't own any of it, to me, we're just
Mm,
at the exact same scenario. It just
Mm.
took us 10 years to get there. And so I think there are a few other variables like that or risks that I'm a bit concerned about. But if everything goes as planned, I think to me, that would be heaven.
All
love that.
right, that's good to hear, man. I just want to hit a quick summary to make sure we've gathered, what your vision is, and we adequately express that to the audience, right? So, your prediction, your belief, your hope for the future of Black media is podcasts, and the way that you're thinking of that is that podcasts offer a low barrier of entry, right? So that aspiring media talent can come in here and they can workshop an idea. They can develop a concept, whether it's for a show, radio program, whatever that is. They can do that independently through their podcast, right? And that allows them to build out the reps, build out the expertise to kind of become their calling card. It also serves as an avenue in which, multiple different shows can come together as a network, right? In a way that we've got enough overlap, but enough difference that we can, attract a large enough audience that's still unified around some concept, and then we start to build, media deals or advertising deals around that, and then it eventually can grow into a Radio One, BET, something of that nature, right? And then kind of the big picture that you're also looking at here is the level of ownership, right? Not just ownership of shows, not just ownership of networks and what that grows into, but also ownership of all the tools that go into it, right? So maybe it's the equipment, the microphones that folks are using, the software tools that folks are using to put all of this stuff together, just every element of it. To you, it looks like podcast is that low barrier of entry for, Black people, people of color within media to build out ownership across all facets of what they do, and could potentially rewrite and completely just like reinvigorate the entire media landscape. Does that capture it pretty well?
You said that better than me. Spot on.
Amazing.
Yeah, that I yo like that. Just hearing you say that, I think to me is like I think I wake up every day pursuing that. And I know like a lot of other people that are passionate about like the podcast industry at large. And I think that's all we like dream about. That's all we want. And because it's so early, to me, it like we wake up every day and we're going to build, and it's still in its infancy and elementary. So it's like it feels like there's a lot to do. But just thinking about that future that you just described is so encouraging.
100%.
Excellent.
And that's what we aim to do with Tools for Time Traveling. Lloyd laid it out for us. He laid it out what we're going to need to get to this future. So it's up to us here, up to you listeners, to help us get there, create the things that we need to get to the future. So Lloyd, thank you so much for your time. Please let the people know where they can find you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You can find me on all platforms at Lloyd, not George, all spelled as one word.
Amazing. All right, cool, everybody. Well, let's keep gearing up to build the future that we want to see. Take it easy.
All right.
Peace.
Peace. All right. We
Yeah,
good?
that was great, man. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Is anything else we wanted to get off there?
Nothing from my end per se.
Cool.
I want to ask you this might go into the podcast, but also just like,
Cool.
just good for us, follow up or what have you. Our mission is talking to as many creatives or creators as we can, podcasts, TV, graphic design, movies, whatever it is, right? So are there any creatives out there in the world that you're just like, yo, so-and-so is like really on the cutting edge of their field, or anything beyond podcasting that's just like really kind of pulling some interest from you that you'd like to see us cover?
Yeah, I have a lot of recommendations for you. All my friends are in the podcast space, so we could keep this convo going. But I have a friend named Naya that works for iHeartMedia that I think would be great. She specializes in podcast marketing, but she just has such a unique perspective on the podcast space. And I think you all would have a great conversation about the future of marketing.
Awesome.
Cool.
Great. I feel like we hit on, because like I think coming into this, I wanted to sort of say like how podcasts could end up being like the next BET or the next like, whatever. But I do think that we started to paint how like maybe this just potentially recontextualizes what we think of as Black media. Like maybe it's not just like a channel that you go to, but it's like an everyday thing. I hope we got that across, because I feel like I feel like that is something that we should maybe contextualize for the audience. But it could. I think there's a lot of different ways that we can accomplish that, even if we didn't maybe like put an exact button on it here.
Yeah.
I think a good way to contextualize that is like one of us can just ask you, George, like, hey, like what is there any closing thought that you want to share with the audience, and then you could do that, or like something else.
Yeah, for sure. I'm good with that.
Okay.
Cool.
Hey, before we wrap for today, I just want to turn it over to you. Is there any, concluding thought or wrap up that you would like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed this convo, and I feel like we covered so much. One last thing I want to highlight is this idea that I think of podcasting being bigger than any one medium or any one channel, right? And so I view podcasting not as like synonymous with, let's just say, BT, for example, or Urban One. I view podcasting as something that all of these platforms could take a part in and participate in, which a lot of them are. So Urban One has a great podcast program. So it's like, I think personally that a lot of these larger companies and even companies that have been like staples in like the Black community do see the benefit of podcasting and are trying to participate. And so as the industry grows, it'll be cool to see podcasting take a bigger role, similar to like their TV slate.
Awesome.
Got it.
Cool.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed this like time flew by. It's been crazy. We've been chatting.
It really did.
Yeah. An hour really just flew by.
Yeah. No, it's great. Yeah, man. So
when did you move in?
June, I think.
Okay.
June, end of June. So okay. It's been a few months, but we had a baby in April. So we had a baby, we looked for a house, bought a house, moved into the house, and
you were like, this is not enough change. The baby.
Yeah, I was like, I need more. And Dez is actually also like literally any day now about to have his first also.
Wow.
So it's an exciting time. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
That's
Fortunately,
amazing.
I'm not looking for a house. It's just one big change I'm dealing with on this end.
Yeah. You might decide after, you're like, nah, this wasn't chaotic enough. Let's do something.
I might.
Yeah. Nah, this is cool. And Des, you're in Atlanta too?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, bad. Because we spoke about Georgia Perimeter. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll be back actually in October or November, so we should get coffee or link.
Yeah.
You won't be able to. You'll have a baby, so we'll find out time to do that.
I'm sure you two can, but I'll be fighting a good fight in here.
Yeah.
Nice.
Cool. I appreciate it, gents. Please have an awesome Friday, and hopefully we connect soon.
Same.
All right.
Oh,
absolutely.
by the way, when you share this with me, I'll put it in my newsletter. Just let me know the dates and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Might get it out soon because I'm speaking at the Black Pod Festival next week.
Oh,
So
nice.
I'm
Okay,
like
cool.
I'm trying to get a few new or at least one new episode up
Yeah.
Yeah.
on the channel because we've taken a bit of a hiatus. So just want to make sure we have like it's a bit refreshed before
Oh,
people
dude,
come
that's
check
gonna
it
be
out.
awesome.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Cool.
Cool.
Have an awesome Friday, and we'll chat soon.
Yep.
All right.
All right, Lloyd.
Take care, man.
Peace.
Peace.
Awesome.
Should we stop cameras or stop recording, or
Uh,
is there anything we
yeah.
need to
Let's.
catch?
Yeah, we should. We can stop speeds. Oh, I'm like, why can't I? I'm on a different computer.
Okay.